I have often reflected on the peculiar relationship between sanctity and violence. Churches are, by their nature, places of peace, consecrated ground, set apart from the turmoil of the world, where the faithful come to seek comfort and the troubled come to find stillness. And yet, throughout history, some of the most terrible acts of human cruelty have been committed within their walls. Perhaps this is because violence, like prayer, seeks an audience. Perhaps it is because the desecration of sacred space carries a symbolic weight that ordinary murder in an ordinary street does not. Or perhaps, and this is the explanation Holmes favored, it is simply because churches are one of the few places where a large number of people can be relied upon to sit still, face forward, and pay attention to a single point of focus, making them ideal environments for a crime that depends upon misdirection. The affair of St. Dunstan's, as it came to be known in the press, though Holmes himself referred to it simply as the church matter, began on a Sunday morning in November of 1897, and it began with death.
Good heavens! What is it?
Look! Dear God, look!
The Reverend Charles Whitmore, vicar of St. Dunstan's Church in Stepney, collapsed at his pulpit during the 11 o'clock service. He had been delivering a sermon on the subject of forgiveness. The text was from Matthew chapter 18. And he was approximately 12 minutes into his address when, according to the testimony of every person present, he stopped speaking mid-sentence, placed both hands upon the edge of the pulpit as though to steady himself, and then fell forward onto the stone floor of the chancel with a sound that one witness described as like a sack of coal dropped from a height. 300 people saw it happen. 300 pairs of eyes were fixed upon the vicar at the moment of his collapse. The choir, the church wardens, the verger, the congregation, every soul in that building was looking at Charles Whitmore when he died, and not one of them saw anything that could explain why. The news reached us at Baker Street within the hour. It arrived not through the usual channels, but through the person of Mrs. Whitmore herself, the vicar's wife, who came to our door in a state of controlled devastation that I found deeply affecting. She was a small, dark-haired woman of about 40, neatly dressed in a gray coat that she had clearly put on in haste, with one button fastened wrong and a hat that sat slightly askew on her head. Her eyes were dry.
Mr. Finch, I have terrible news. Young Thomas, he is gone.
She had not yet begun to weep, and I suspected that when she did, the weeping would be terrible. And her voice, when she spoke, was steady with the forced composure of a person who is holding herself together by an act of will that cannot last indefinitely. My husband is dead, Mr. Holmes. He collapsed during his sermon this morning. The doctor says it was his heart, but Charles did not have a bad heart. He was 52 years old and as strong as an ox. He walked 4 miles every day. He never smoked. He drank nothing stronger than communion wine. And 3 days ago, he told me that someone had threatened to kill him.
He was strong, vigorous. There is nothing wrong with him. This diagnosis is false.
Holmes, who had been reading a monograph on medieval poisons when Mrs. Whitmore arrived, set it aside with the careful deliberation of a man who recognizes that the theoretical has just been superseded by the actual. Sit down, Mrs. Whitmore. Watson, pour the lady some brandy. Now, tell me about the threat. She sat. She did not touch the brandy. She folded her hands in her lap and spoke. On Thursday evening, 3 days before the service, Charles received a letter. It was delivered by hand, not through the post. He read it in his study and then came to me looking, I can only describe it as shaken. Charles was not a man who shook easily. He had served as a military chaplain in Afghanistan before taking the living at St. Dunstan's. He had seen terrible things, but this letter shook him. Did he tell you what it said? He told me that someone had written to him demanding that he resign his position at St. Dunstan's and leave London within a week. If he refused, the letter said, he would die during his next Sunday sermon. Those were the exact words. He would die during his next Sunday sermon. Those were the exact words. Charles showed me the letter. It was typed, not handwritten, on ordinary paper. There was no signature. He said he had no idea who had sent it or why anyone would want him to leave St. Dunstan's. Did he keep the letter? He burned it. He said he would not give a coward's threat the dignity of preservation. I begged him not to destroy it. I thought we should go to the police. But Charles was proud, Mr. Holmes. Stubborn. He said he would not be driven from his own church by an anonymous bully. And so he preached on Sunday as usual. And so he preached on Sunday, and 12 minutes into his sermon, he fell dead. Holmes was quiet for a long moment. His grey eyes rested on Mrs. Whitmore with an expression that combined professional assessment with something I recognized as genuine human sympathy, a combination that appeared in his face more often than his reputation would suggest. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to ask you some questions that may seem intrusive. I ask them not out of idle curiosity, but because the answers may be essential to understanding what happened to your husband. Ask me anything. Your husband's position at St. Dunstan's. How long had he held it? 11 years. Since 1886. Was he happy in the position? He was devoted to it. St. Dunstan's is not a wealthy parish. Stepney is a poor area, and the congregation is largely working class. But Charles loved the work. He loved the people. He was a good man, Mr. Holmes. I know that every widow says that about her husband, but in this case it happens to be true. Did he have enemies? None that I knew of. He was universally liked, not merely tolerated, but genuinely liked. The congregation adored him. The other clergy in the diocese respected him. Even the bishop, who disagrees with Charles on several theological points, spoke warmly of him at the last diocesan conference. And yet someone wanted him dead badly enough to warn him in advance and then carry out the threat in front of 300 witnesses. Yes, that suggests a killer of extraordinary confidence, or extraordinary desperation. We went to St. Dunstan's that afternoon. The church had been closed by the police following the vicar's death. And a constable stood guard at the main entrance, a young man who looked profoundly uncomfortable in his role as sentinel of a house of God, and who admitted us without argument when Holmes presented his card. St. Dunstan's was a large Victorian church, of the kind that proliferated in the East End during the middle decades of the century. Built of dark brick, with a square tower, tall arched windows of stained glass, and an interior that was designed to accommodate a congregation of several hundred. The nave was long and wide, with rows of dark wooden pews on either side of a central aisle. The chancel, the area around the altar, was raised 2 steps above the nave and separated from it by a low wooden screen. The pulpit stood to the left of the chancel, a substantial structure of carved oak, elevated some 4 feet above the floor and accessed by a narrow flight of steps. It was from this pulpit that the Reverend Whitmore had delivered his final sermon, and it was at the foot of this pulpit that he had fallen. Holmes examined the pulpit with the meticulous thoroughness I had come to expect. He climbed the narrow steps, stood in the place where Whitmore had stood, and ran his hands over every surface, the carved panels, the bookrest, the rail, the narrow shelf beneath where the vicar might rest a glass of water or a handkerchief. He examined the steps, the floor of the chancel around the base of the pulpit, and the stone flags onto which Whitmore had fallen. "Watson, come up here." I climbed the pulpit steps and stood beside him. The view from the pulpit was commanding. The entire nave spread out below, with its rows of pews stretching back to the main entrance. From this vantage point, every member of the congregation would have been visible to the preacher, and conversely, the preacher would have been visible to every member of the congregation. 300 people, Holmes said. All looking at this spot, all watching the vicar speak, and none of them saw anything. What is there to see? The man collapsed. If it was poison, it was administered before the service began, and the timing of its effect was either calculated with extraordinary precision or was a matter of chance. A poison that takes effect exactly 12 minutes into a sermon is not a common pharmaceutical event. He crouched and examined the bookrest. There is a glass here. Do you see it, Watson? A small glass, pushed to the back of the shelf, partially concealed by the Bible. It contains what appears to be water. He lifted the glass carefully and sniffed its contents. Then he held it out to me. What do you make of this? I took the glass and examined it. The liquid was clear and appeared to be ordinary water, but when I brought it close to my nose, I detected, very faintly, an odor that was not water. It was sharp, slightly acrid, with a bitter undertone that I associated from my medical training with certain alkaloid compounds. There is something in this water, I said. Something that should not be there. Yes. The question is what, and the further question is who put it there. Holmes took the glass back and placed it carefully in a handkerchief, wrapping it for transport. This glass was on the pulpit shelf when Whitmore began his sermon. He would have drunk from it. Vicars frequently take water during sermons, particularly long ones. If the water was poisoned, Whitmore would have ingested the poison during the first few minutes of his address, and the effects would have manifested shortly thereafter. 12 minutes. That is consistent with several fast-acting poisons. Indeed. But the critical question is not what poison was used. We can determine that through chemical analysis. The critical question is who had access to the pulpit before the service began. Who placed that glass of water on the shelf? And who had the opportunity to add something to it? We descended from the pulpit and sought out the verger, a Mr. Horace Blunt, a stout, red-faced man of 60 who had served at St. Dunstan's for over 20 years and who was, understandably, in a state of considerable distress. The water, Holmes said. Who prepares the water for the pulpit? Blunt wiped his forehead with a large handkerchief. I do, sir. Every Sunday morning, I fill a glass from the vestry tap and place it on the pulpit shelf before the service begins. I've done it every Sunday for 20 years. At what time did you place the glass this morning? At 10:30. 30 minutes before the service. And between 10:30 and 11 o'clock, when the service began, who had access to the church? Well, everyone, sir. The doors are open from 10 o'clock for early arrivals. The choir assembles in the choir stalls at 11:15. The churchwardens are in and out. The vicar himself arrives through the vestry door, which leads directly from the vicarage garden. So for 30 minutes, the glass of water sat on the pulpit shelf, unattended, in a church that was open to anyone who cared to enter. Yes, sir, but the pulpit is in full view of the nave. Anyone going up there would have been seen. Not necessarily. If someone approached during a moment when the church was relatively empty, say between 10:30 and 11:15, before the bulk of the congregation arrived, they might have reached the pulpit unobserved, or they might have used the vestry entrance, which provides access to the chancel without passing through the nave. Blunt paled. The vestry door is usually unlocked during service preparation. Anyone who knew the layout of the church could have entered that way. Yes, and anyone who knew the vicar's routine, the glass of water, the timing, the position on the shelf, could have added something to the glass without being detected. Holmes thanked the verger and turned to me. Watson, I want you to take this glass to Bart's and have it analyzed immediately. I will remain here and examine the vestry and the vicarage. There is a great deal more to learn about the Reverend Charles Whitmore and the parish of St. Dunstan's. While I was at Bart's supervising the chemical analysis of the water glass, Holmes conducted what he later described to me as the most instructive afternoon I have spent in a church since I investigated the matter of the Archbishop's missing crozier in '89. He began with the vestry, a small functional room behind the chancel, furnished with robes, prayer books, and the administrative paraphernalia of parish life. The vestry had 2 doors, one opening into the chancel and one opening into a narrow passage that led to the vicarage garden. Both doors were fitted with ordinary locks, and the vestry key was kept, according to Blunt, on a hook in the verger's cupboard, a location known to every member of the church staff and, presumably, to anyone who had spent time observing the routines of St. Dunstan's. Holmes examined the vestry door to the passage and found that the lock showed signs of recent use. Fresh scratches on the brass plate, consistent with the key being inserted and turned by someone unfamiliar with the lock's particular stiffness. The passage itself led through a small garden to a gate that opened onto a side street. The gate was not locked. An unlocked gate, Holmes noted, leading to an unmonitored passage, ending at a vestry door whose key is publicly accessible. The security arrangements of St. Dunstan's are, from a criminal's perspective, commendably accommodating. He then turned his attention to the vicarage, a modest but pleasant house adjoining the church, where the Whitmores had lived for 11 years. Mrs. Whitmore had returned to the house after her visit to Baker Street, and she admitted Holmes with the quiet composure of a woman who has reached the stage of grief where practical action provides more comfort than tears. Holmes asked to see the vicar's study. It was a small room on the ground floor, book-lined, simply furnished, with a desk, a chair, and a window overlooking the church garden. The desk was covered with the ordinary debris of clerical administration: sermon notes, parish records, correspondence, a church calendar. "Mrs. Whitmore, you said your husband burned the threatening letter. Did he say anything else about it? Any detail, however small, that might help me identify the sender?" She thought carefully. "He said the letter mentioned something specific, something about the church finances. He said the writer accused him of, I believe the phrase was, misappropriating parish funds." Charles was furious. He said it was an outrageous lie. "Parish funds? That is a specific accusation. Has there been any dispute about the finances of St. Dunstan's?" "Not that I know of." Charles was meticulous about the accounts. He kept detailed records and presented them to the church council every quarter. "There has never been a query." "Who are the members of the church council?" "There are 6 members, including Charles. The senior church warden is Mr. Gerald Pike. He is a local businessman, very involved in church affairs. The other members are Mrs. Avery, Mr. Dunning, Mr. Cassidy, and Dr. Shepherd. I should like to speak with all of them, but first, Mr. Pike, tell me about him." A slight hesitation crossed Mrs. Whitmore's face. "Gerald Pike is a prominent man in Stepney. He owns several properties and a building firm. He has been a member of St. Dunstan's for about 8 years and became senior church warden 4 years ago. He is energetic, ambitious perhaps. He has strong views about how the church should be run." "And do those views align with your husband's?" "Not always. Gerald wanted to modernize the church. New heating, new lighting, repairs to the roof. Charles agreed in principle but disagreed about the pace and the cost. He thought Gerald was pushing too fast and spending too much. There were discussions. Disagreements. Yes, disagreements, but they were resolved amicably, or so I believed. One more question. Your husband's sermon this morning, the one on forgiveness. Was this a subject he had planned in advance, or was it chosen recently?" Mrs. Whitmore's expression changed, a flicker of something that might have been surprise or might have been recognition. "He chose it last week, after receiving the letter. He said he wanted to preach about forgiveness because he believed the person who sent the letter needed to hear it." Holmes sat very still for a moment. "Your husband received a death threat, and his response was to preach a sermon on forgiveness directed at the person who threatened him." "Yes. That is either the most courageous or the most reckless act I have ever encountered." "Possibly both." Gerald Pike lived in a substantial house on the commercial road, the kind of house that announced its owner's prosperity without quite descending into vulgarity. It was large, well-maintained, and furnished with the heavy, dark, expensive taste of a self-made man who had studied what wealthy people owned and had purchased accordingly. Pike himself was a broad, blunt-featured man of about 45, with the thick hands and direct gaze of someone who had built his fortune through physical labor and practical intelligence rather than education or social advantage. He received us in a sitting room that smelled of new carpet and cigar smoke, and his manner was that of a man who is accustomed to being in charge of conversations and does not intend to relinquish the habit for the sake of a consulting detective. Terrible business about the vicar. Terrible. I was there when it happened. Front pew, as always. One moment he was speaking, the next he was on the floor. I was the first to reach him, as a matter of fact. I climbed over the screen and got to him before anyone else. You were the first person to reach the body? I was. I loosened his collar and checked for a pulse. Nothing. The doctor, Dr. Shepherd, one of our council members, was there within a minute. He confirmed that the vicar was dead. Mr. Pike, I need to ask you about the finances of St. Dunstan's. The directness of the question produced a visible reaction. Not guilt exactly, but a tightening of the jaw and a narrowing of the eyes that suggested the subject was not a comfortable one. What about them? Were there any irregularities? Irregularities? No, the vicar kept the accounts and they were always in order. I reviewed them every quarter as senior church warden. Everything was above board. And yet someone wrote to the vicar accusing him of misappropriating parish funds. Pike's thick features showed genuine surprise. Who told you that? Mrs. Whitmore. The vicar received a threatening letter last week. The letter accused him of financial misconduct and demanded his resignation. When he refused, the writer threatened to kill him during his next Sunday sermon. Good God! And you think this is connected to his death? I think it would be a remarkable coincidence if it were not. Mr. Pike, you have been involved in disputes with the vicar about church spending. You wanted to modernize the church. He resisted. How serious were these disagreements? Pike leaned forward, his thick hands spread on his knees. They were disagreements, Mr. Holmes. Not wars. I wanted to improve the building. The roof leaked. The heating was inadequate. The congregation was declining because people don't want to sit in a cold, damp church for an hour every Sunday. I proposed a program of repairs and improvements, funded partly by the church reserves and partly by my own contribution. The vicar thought it was too much, too fast. We argued. We compromised. That is how church councils work. How large was your proposed contribution? £2,000. I blinked. It was a very substantial sum, the equivalent of several years' income for most people in Stepney. And in return for this contribution, what did you expect? Pike's jaw tightened again. I expected the church to be improved. That is all. You did not expect, for example, to have a greater say in how the church was run, to influence the appointment of a new vicar, should the current one depart, to establish yourself as the dominant figure in the parish. You are putting words in my mouth, Mr. Holmes. I am putting possibilities in the air, Mr. Pike. You are a successful businessman. You understand the relationship between money and influence. A man who donates £2,000 to a church acquires, whether he intends to or not, a certain leverage over its affairs. If the vicar who resists his plans were to be removed, through resignation, through scandal, or through death, that leverage would increase considerably. Pike stood up. He was a large man, and standing he seemed to fill the room. I did not kill Charles Whitmore. I did not write him a threatening letter. I did not put anything in his water glass. I was sitting in the front pew of that church when he fell, and I was the first person to try to help him. You are welcome to investigate me, Mr. Holmes. Investigate my finances, my movements, my correspondence. You will find nothing, because there is nothing to find. I shall certainly investigate, Mr. Pike. Thank you for the invitation. Dr. Shepherd, the physician who had confirmed the vicar's death, was a different proposition entirely. He was a thin, quiet man of about 50, with the careful manner and watchful eyes of someone who spent his professional life observing symptoms and drawing conclusions. He practiced from a small surgery on the Mile End Road, and he received us there among the bottles and instruments of his trade. "The vicar's death," he said, when Holmes explained the purpose of our visit. "Yes. I examined him immediately after he fell. He was dead before I reached him. The cause of death in my initial assessment was cardiac arrest. The heart stopped suddenly and without warning. Could the cardiac arrest have been induced by poison?" Shepherd removed his spectacles and polished them, a gesture I recognized as the medical equivalent of buying time. "It is possible. There are several substances that can induce cardiac arrest in a healthy individual. Digitalis in large doses, aconitine, strephanthine. If such a substance were administered without the victim's knowledge, the symptoms would be indistinguishable from natural cardiac failure." "You were at the service this morning?" "I was. I sit in the third pew on the right side. I've been a member of St. Dunstan's for 12 years. Did you notice anything unusual before the service? Any person or activity that was out of the ordinary?" Shepherd considered. "I arrived at approximately 11:15. The church was filling up. There were perhaps 100 people already seated. The choir was assembling. The vicar had not yet appeared. He usually enters from the vestry at 11 o'clock precisely. I saw Mr. Pike in the front pew, as always. I saw the verger, Mr. Blunt, making his usual preparations." "Did you see anyone approach the pulpit?" "No, but I was not specifically watching the pulpit. I was reading the order of service." "Dr. Shepherd, I must ask you a direct question. Were you aware of any tension between the vicar and any member of the church council?" Shepherd replaced his spectacles and looked at Holmes with an expression that balanced professional caution against personal concern. "There was tension between the vicar and Mr. Pike. That was well known. Pike is a forceful personality who is accustomed to getting his way. The vicar was a principled man who was not easily moved. The two of them clashed regularly over church policy. Was the tension serious enough to produce a threat?" "A threat? I find that difficult to believe. Pike is a businessman, not a criminal. He may be overbearing, but he is not violent." "And the other council members? Any conflicts there?" "Mrs. Avery and Mr. Dunning are quiet people who rarely disagree with anyone. Mr. Cassidy," he paused. "Mr. Cassidy has had some difficulties recently. Financial difficulties. He came to me for a medical certificate. He said he needed time away from his work for reasons of health. I gave him one, but I was not entirely convinced that his health was the primary issue." "What was the primary issue?" "I believe he was in debt, serious debt. He asked the vicar for a loan from the church's discretionary fund, a small amount of money that the vicar controlled for emergency assistance to parishioners. The vicar gave him £50. That was 3 months ago. I do not know whether the money was repaid." This was a new thread, and Holmes pulled it with his customary persistence. "Where can I find Mr. Cassidy?" "He lives on Globe Road, number 43. But Mr. Holmes, I should tell you that Cassidy is not a man of violence. He is a clerk, mild, anxious, easily overwhelmed. The idea of him threatening anyone, let alone murdering a vicar during a church service, is, frankly, it is absurd. In my experience, Dr. Shepherd, the most absurd suspects are frequently the most dangerous. It is the people who seem incapable of violence who are best able to commit it without being suspected. Mr. William Cassidy lived in a narrow terraced house on Globe Road, the kind of house that is clean but bare, where every stick of furniture has been maintained with desperate care and every curtain has been washed one time too many. It was the house of a man who was losing a war against poverty and who was determined to surrender with dignity. Cassidy himself opened the door. He was a slight, pallid man of about 35, with thinning hair and the nervous, blinking manner of someone who expects bad news and is bracing for impact. "Mr. Holmes, I rather thought you might come. You know why I'm here? The vicar. Yes, I heard what happened. I was not at the service this morning. I have not been attending for the past 3 weeks. My circumstances have been difficult, and I did not feel I could face... He trailed off. Holmes waited. Cassidy led us into a small front room that was spotlessly clean and almost entirely bare of ornamentation. There were no books, no pictures, no ornaments, only the essentials of furniture and a vase of paper flowers on the mantelpiece that had been arranged with pathetic care. Mr. Cassidy, the vicar, received a threatening letter last week. The letter accused him of misappropriating parish funds and demanded his resignation. Were you aware of this? Cassidy's pale face went a shade paler. No, I was not aware. The vicar loaned you £50 from the church's discretionary fund 3 months ago. Was this loan repaid? A long silence. Cassidy sat down heavily in the one remaining armchair and pressed his hands against his face. When he looked up, his eyes were red. No, it was not repaid. I could not repay it. I used the money to cover a debt. A gambling debt, Mr. Holmes, I am ashamed to say. And when it was gone, I had nothing left to give back. I told the vicar I would repay him as soon as I could, but he was kind about it. He said there was no hurry. He said the fund existed to help people in need, and that I should not torment myself. And yet you stopped attending church. I could not look at him. Every Sunday, standing in that congregation, knowing that I owed him money I could not repay. It was unbearable. I'm a proud man, Mr. Holmes. Or I was. There is not much pride left. Mr. Cassidy, I need to ask you where you were between 10:30 and 11 o'clock this morning. I was here, in this house, alone. I did not go out. Can anyone confirm that? No, I live alone. My wife left me 6 months ago. There's no one to confirm anything. Holmes studied the man for a long moment. Cassidy sat in his bare room and submitted to the scrutiny with the passive resignation of a person who has nothing left to lose. Mr. Cassidy, did you write the threatening letter to the vicar? No. Did you have any involvement in his death? No, I swear it. Charles Whitmore was the kindest man I've ever known. He gave me money when I was desperate. He never judged me. He never demanded repayment. I would sooner cut off my own hand than harm him. Holmes nodded. I believe you, Mr. Cassidy, but I should warn you that your lack of an alibi and your financial difficulties will make you a person of interest to the police. I would recommend that you remain available and cooperative. We left the small, bare house and walked in silence for several minutes. The Stepney streets were grey and cold, and the evening was closing in. He did not do it, Holmes said flatly. How can you be certain? Because the man who killed Charles Whitmore was capable of planning and executing a murder in front of 300 witnesses without being detected. That requires intelligence, nerve, and a capacity for deception that William Cassidy does not possess. Cassidy is a man who cannot even deceive himself. His guilt over the unpaid loan was written on every surface of that house. A man who arranges paper flowers on his mantelpiece because he cannot afford real ones is not a man who poisons a vicar's water glass with cold-blooded precision. Then who? The person who had the most to gain from Whitmore's removal. The person who wanted control of the parish and its resources. The person who was first to reach the body. A fact which, I confess, I find suggestive. Pike? Pike. But not Pike alone. There is something else at work here, Watson. The accusation of financial misappropriation, the threatening letter, the specific demand for resignation. This is not merely a murder. It is a campaign. Someone wanted Whitmore gone, and when intimidation failed, they resorted to poison. And the accusation of financial misconduct suggests that the church finances are at the center of whatever is happening. The chemical analysis of the water glass confirmed what I had suspected. The water contained a significant quantity of strophanthine, a cardiac glycoside derived from the seeds of the African strophanthus plant. In the dose present in the glass, it would have been lethal within 10 to 15 minutes of ingestion, causing a rapid and irreversible cardiac arrest that would be virtually indistinguishable from natural heart failure. Strophanthine, Holmes said when I reported the results. Not a common choice. More exotic than digitalis. Less well known than aconitine. It suggests a killer with specific pharmacological knowledge, or access to someone who possesses such knowledge. A doctor, possibly, or a chemist, or someone who has traveled in Africa, where the strophanthus plant is used by certain indigenous peoples as an arrow poison. The range of possibilities is not wide, Watson. We are looking for someone who knew about strophanthine, who had access to it, and who had the opportunity to add it to the vicar's water glass between 10:30 and 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. Holmes spent the following day examining the financial records of St. Dunstan's. He obtained them through Mrs. Whitmore, who had access to her husband's files, and he spread them across the Baker Street desk and worked through them with the concentrated intensity of a man deciphering a code, which, in a sense, he was. The accounts were meticulous. The Reverend Whitmore had kept detailed records of every penny that passed through the parish, the collections, the donations, the repairs fund, the discretionary fund, the building fund. Every entry was dated, described, and balanced. The accounts were, to all appearances, in perfect order. And yet Holmes found the anomaly. It took him 4 hours, but he found it. "Watson, look at this." He pointed to a series of entries in the building fund, the fund that Gerald Pike had been so eager to augment with his £2,000 contribution. These entries show payments to a building contractor named Bramwell and Sons for roof repairs carried out over the past 2 years. The total paid to Bramwell and Sons is £3,400. That seems a great deal for roof repairs. It is. But that is not the anomaly. The anomaly is this. He produced a separate document, a receipt from Bramwell and Sons, which he had obtained through his own inquiries. The actual cost of the roof repairs, according to Bramwell and Sons' own records, was £1,800. The church paid £3,400. The difference, £1,600, was paid to Bramwell and Sons, but was not for roof repairs. It was paid at the instruction of the senior churchwarden. Pike. He instructed the contractor to submit inflated invoices. The contractor complied, probably because Pike's own building firm does business with Bramwell and Sons and the relationship depends on cooperation. The excess payments, £1,600, were then rebated by Bramwell to an account controlled by Pike. In other words, Pike was using the church building fund as a mechanism for stealing from the parish. And the vicar discovered this. The vicar discovered it, or was about to discover it. The threatening letter accused Whitmore of misappropriating parish funds. That accusation was not merely false, it was a projection. Pike was the one misappropriating funds, and he accused the vicar of doing so in order to create confusion and, if possible, to force the vicar's resignation before the truth came to light. And when the vicar refused to resign, Pike killed him. He could not allow Whitmore to continue as vicar, because a vicar who was investigating the church finances would inevitably discover the fraud. The threat failed. The sermon on forgiveness, which Whitmore directed at his unknown threatener, must have seemed to Pike like a deliberate provocation, and so Pike acted. But how? He was sitting in the front pew. 300 people saw him there. 300 people saw him sitting in the front pew from 11 o'clock onward. But the poison was placed in the glass before 11 o'clock, during the preparation period, when the church was open but not yet full. Pike knows the layout of the church intimately. He knows about the vestry door, the passage to the garden, the unlocked gate. He could have entered through the vestry, reached the pulpit, added the strophanthin to the glass, and returned to his seat in the nave. All within a few minutes, while the church was still largely empty. Can you prove this? I can prove the fraud. The invoices, the rebates, the hidden account. All of it is documented, and the fraud provides the motive. What I cannot yet prove is that Pike himself placed the poison in the glass. For that, I need either a witness or a confession. And the strophanthin. Where did he obtain it? Holmes smiled thinly. That is the question that will break the case. Strophanthin is not available from an ordinary chemist. It must be obtained from a specialist supplier or from someone with access to pharmaceutical or botanical collections. If I can trace the source of the poison, I can trace it to Pike, or to someone acting on his behalf. The trail, when Holmes followed it, led not to Pike directly, but to a figure we had not anticipated. Dr. Shepherd. Holmes's inquiries among the pharmaceutical suppliers of London revealed that a quantity of strophanthin had been purchased 6 weeks earlier from a specialist chemical supply house in Clerkenwell. The buyer had given the name of Dr. James Shepherd and had presented a medical credential. The purchase was recorded as being for research purposes. When Holmes confronted Shepherd with this information, the doctor's careful composure disintegrated. He asked me to obtain it for him, Shepherd said. His voice was barely audible. Pike, he came to me 6 weeks ago and asked me to purchase a quantity of strophanthin. He said it was for use in his building work. Something about timber treatment, pest control, I don't remember. He said he couldn't obtain it himself because he didn't have a medical qualification, and the supplier required one. And you did not question this? I should have. I know I should have. But Pike is... He is a persuasive man, a powerful man. He has influence in this community. He owns properties, employs people, sits on committees. When Gerald Pike asks you to do something, you do it. That is how it works in Stepney. You provided a lethal poison to a man who used it to murder the vicar of your church. I did not know what he intended to do with it. I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I did not know. When the vicar collapsed, I suspected. The symptoms were consistent with strophanthin poisoning, but I could not believe it. I could not believe that Pike would, and yet you said nothing. You examined the body. You pronounced the cause of death as cardiac arrest. You made no mention of poisoning. Shepherd's face was grey. I was afraid. Pike is a dangerous man. If I had accused him publicly, in front of the congregation, at the scene, he would have denied it, and his word carries more weight in Stepney than mine. I would have been ruined. My practice, my reputation, everything I have built over 20 years. So you chose your practice over the truth. I chose my survival over the truth. I am not proud of it, Mr. Holmes, but I am alive, and I intend to remain so. Holmes regarded him with an expression that combined contempt with something that might, in another man, have been compassion. Dr. Shepherd, you will provide a full written statement to Inspector Lestrade detailing your purchase of the strophanthin, Pike's request, and your suspicions regarding the cause of the vicar's death. You will testify to these facts at trial. In return, I will recommend that you be treated as a witness rather than an accomplice, though I make no guarantees about the outcome. Shepherd nodded slowly. I will do it. I should have done it from the beginning. Yes, you should have. Gerald Pike was arrested the following morning at his home on the Commercial Road. Lestrade conducted the arrest, accompanied by Holmes, Watson, and 2 constables. Pike received them in the same sitting room where we had interviewed him 2 days earlier, and his reaction to the charge of murder was, I must say, remarkable. He did not protest his innocence. He did not bluster or threaten or demand a solicitor. He sat down in his leather armchair, folded his thick hands in his lap, and looked at Holmes with an expression of what I can only describe as professional assessment, the look of one strategist evaluating another. How did you find out? He asked. The accounts. The inflated invoices. Bramwell and Sons. Pike nodded slowly. The accounts. Yes, I should have been more careful with the accounts, but the vicar was too thorough. He would have found it eventually. He had already found it. That is why you sent the letter. I sent the letter to give him a chance to leave quietly. I did not want to kill him. I wanted him gone, but he wouldn't go. He preached a sermon on forgiveness. Pike shook his head with something that might almost have been admiration. Forgiveness. Standing there in his pulpit, looking out at the man who had threatened to kill him and talking about forgiveness. He knew it was me. He must have known. Did he know? I think so. He looked at me during the sermon, looked straight at me, and the expression on his face was not anger, not fear, just sadness, as though he was sorry for me, as though he pitied me. Pike's voice cracked. That was worse than anything, Mr. Holmes, worse than hatred. He pitied me. And so you killed him. I killed him because he would have exposed me, the fraud, the building fund, £3,400 that I could never have repaid. I would have gone to prison. I would have lost everything, my business, my properties, my standing, everything I built in 30 years. You had Dr. Shepherd obtain the Strophanthine. Shepherd was easy. He's weak. Everyone in Stepney knows he's weak. I told him I needed it for timber treatment, and he didn't ask questions because he didn't want to know the answers. And the glass of water on the pulpit? I went in through the vestry passage at 10:20, before anyone else arrived. I knew the verger had already placed the glass. He does it every Sunday at 10:30, regular as clockwork. I added the Strophanthine. Just a few drops. It doesn't take much. And left the way I came. I was in my pew by 11:15. No one saw me. No one suspected. 300 people saw a man die, and none of them saw you kill him. That is the beauty of it, isn't it? Everyone was looking at the vicar. No one was looking at me. He paused. I suppose that's over now. It is over. Pike looked around his sitting room. The heavy furniture, the new carpet, the trappings of the prosperity he had spent his life building and his crime maintaining. Then he looked at Holmes one final time. He was a good man, you know. The vicar. He deserved better than me. Yes, Holmes said. He did. Gerald Pike was tried at the Old Bailey in January of 1898 and convicted of the murder of the Reverend Charles Whitmore. He was sentenced to death and hanged at Pentonville Prison in March of that year. He showed no emotion at the verdict and made no appeal. Dr. Shepherd was charged as an accessory. He pleaded guilty and received a sentence of 5 years. His medical license was revoked. William Cassidy was cleared of all suspicion. The Church Council, in its first act following the resolution of the case, voted to forgive his debt to the discretionary fund. He wept when they told him. Mrs. Whitmore remained in the vicarage for several months, supervising the appointment of a new vicar and the restoration of the parish finances. The stolen funds were largely recovered through the sale of Pike's properties, which the courts ordered to be liquidated for the benefit of the parish. Holmes and I attended the service at which the new vicar, a young man named Reynolds, earnest and slightly nervous, preached his first sermon. The church was full. The pulpit had been cleaned and polished. A new glass of water sat on the shelf. Holmes sat in the back pew, which was as close to a church as he generally cared to be. He listened to the sermon, a competent but unremarkable address on the subject of trust, with the polite attention of a man fulfilling a social obligation. When it was over, he stood, put on his hat, and walked with me out into the cold January air. "It is a strange thing," he said as we walked toward the Mile End Road to find a cab. Whitmore knew he was going to die. He had been threatened. He knew the threat was serious, and instead of running, instead of going to the police, instead of taking any of the sensible precautions that a reasonable man would take, he stood up in his pulpit and preached about forgiveness. You think he was foolish? I think he was brave. Foolish and brave are not mutually exclusive, Watson. In fact, they are more often found in combination than apart. But there is something in what he did that I find, I will not say admirable, because admiration implies that I would do the same, and I would not. I would have gone to the police, but there is something in the act of standing before your enemy and offering mercy instead of fear that commands a certain respect. He believed in what he preached. He believed in it enough to die for it. That is more than most men can say about anything they believe. Holmes flagged down a passing cab. Baker Street, Watson. I find I'm in need of my pipe and a problem that does not involve theology. We climbed into the cab, and the church of St. Dunstan's receded behind us. Its dark brick tower rising above the Stepney rooftops, its stained glass windows catching the last grey light of the January afternoon. Inside, 300 people were filing out through the doors, back into the world, carrying with them the memory of a vicar who had died in the place he loved, speaking the words he believed to the people he served. The pulpit was empty now, but the words about forgiveness, the words that a good man had spoken to a bad man in the moments before his death. Those words, I believe, did not die with him. They hung in the air of that church like the last note of a bell, and somewhere in the hearts of the 300 people who heard them, they continued to ring.